Welcome to the Flexible Philosophy Podcast, where we sit down with leading thinkers to talk about the ways that their ideas can be put into practice. I'm your host, Hamza King, and on this episode, I'll be discussing economics for neglected places with Paul Collier, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government and author of Left Behind, A New Economics for Neglected Places. Thank you for being with us, and we hope you enjoy listening. Sheffield was once the steel-making capital of the world. During the First Industrial Revolution, almost half of the steel used in Europe was produced in Sheffield, and during both World Wars, the city became a bombing target because of the central role it played in arming the British military. This rich steel-making tradition began to decline under Margaret Thatcher. In the 1980s, market forces caused several of Sheffield's steelworks to close, and the British steel industry was ultimately privatised. Sheffield, once known as the City of Steel, has never fully recovered, and South Yorkshire is now the poorest region in England. South Yorkshire is not an isolated case. In middle-income countries across the world, time and resources are being invested into capital cities and regions around them, at the expense of rural and coastal regions located further away from the capital. These left-behind regions are in dire need of development. Paul Collier, an expert in the political, economic and developmental predicament of low-income regions, joins me today to discuss why these regions are falling behind and what can be done to improve them. Thanks for coming on, Paul.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Well, you've written several books on a range of issues, but all of your work offers practical solutions for improving the lives of those living in poor communities, which have been ignored by central governments and global institutions. Now, many of our listeners will have read some of your books, and I'm sure that they'd love to know more about why you've dedicated your life to thinking about ways that we can help the less fortunate.
I was a creature of 1968, I suppose. I myself had been amazingly lucky. My parents both left school when they were 12, so had no opportunities in life. One was a pork butcher, the other was a shop assistant. And so I was given my start. Even then, I was lucky to get where I got. And so I always had that sense, well, if I hadn't been so damn lucky, I'd have been in a job of work like everybody else I knew. And so that sense of being very privileged, very, very fortunate, did lead me and a lot of other people to say, well, if I'm getting all this education, it must be useful to something. And at the time, economics had a very grandiose view of what it could do, and I was part of that. So I thought, well, if I've got all this knowledge, I should try and put it to use on behalf of people who haven't had all those chances. Now, I'm a representative of a great mass of left-behind people. I owe it to the rest of them to use my opportunities. So that was a naive idea, I suppose.
Yes, and you are a South Yorkshireman yourself, so I suppose there is a sense in which you have a personal attachment, as you said, to the work you've been doing. But you touched on this idea just there of economics as a discipline changing over the course of the 20th century, and the optimism that economists had has kind of been tempered. So I was wondering what over the course of the period that you've been teaching economics has changed in the discipline of economics. I'm thinking, largely here, but particularly about the concept of Homo economicus, or, economic man.
Yeah, in a nutshell, it's sort of the rise and fall of Homo economicus. So my generation of economists learnt a very crude Darwinian account of human beings, which said it's the survival of the fittest. So what are we? We've evolved to be very greedy, very selfish, and naturally lazy. We don't want to work. The tragedy of humanity is we've got to work. We want to consume. And so economics became an account of human behavior. It was a theory of how humans behaved. It was a terribly crude theory in which they were greedy, lazy, didn't want to work, but had to, and were basically there to consume. And as consumers, we had preferences that were revealed in our choices. And so that's the theory of revealed preference. And it is a total travesty of how normal human beings behave. What it describes in psychology, they describe this guy as a sociopath, basically. Amoral sociopath. Totally untrustworthy.
Bit crude, yeah.
Just doesn't need anything, right? He's there for his own purposes and nothing else. I mean, if you met such people, you run a mile. Or if you were young and fit, you'd punch them, I mean. But that's what became terribly convenient, because as economics formalized, we wanted to be able to give an account of behavior in which humans' behavior could be predicted. So we were predicting how people would behave using this account of their motivation. So it's a theory of motivation. And as such, it's a travesty of what we now know from evolutionary biology, which tells us that actually we didn't evolve like that at all. There's a tiny percentage of us who behave a bit like that. It's about 3% of the population. The other 7% of us are an amazingly pro-social mammal. We're the most pro-social mammal. Why? Because in the fierce heat of evolutionary survival, coming down from the trees, we weren't very well equipped to survive. We didn't have claws, we couldn't run fast, we didn't have scales, we didn't have fur, and so most humans died out when they came down from trees. The only communities that survived was indeed people who lived in communities of about 150, and helped each other, learned how to cooperate. So we've evolved to be by far the most cooperative pro-social mammal. And so we're hardwired to behave in a way that's reciprocal, that we will help others in our network community as long as they help us in return, or there's an expectation that they will help. That's a sort of, if you like, a moral obligation that I'll help you in return for you at some stage helping me. And it doesn't have to be instant. In a community, we can learn to trust each other and say, well, on average, by working cooperatively, you'll all be better off. So that's the real human behavior. It's what modern evolutionary biology tells us. It's what modern social psychology finds. It's just sort of bypassed economics.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was actually listening to a lecture by Joseph Heath a few months ago. He's a business ethicist. He's done a lot of work on anthropology, and he said, we've actually recently, studies have found, overtaken ants in terms of how social human beings are. So there's an ultra-sociality. And to kind of contextualize this, because I saw, and I've read in other bits of work you've written, that you're a communitarian. Would you describe yourself as a communitarian, or?
Yes, very much so. The moral philosophy I depend upon and work on is Michael Sandel's concept of contributive justice. I mean, if we run through the history of moral philosophy, the big figure when I was a student was Rawls, who came up with this concept of distributive justice, which was supposed to be a refutation of utilitarianism. So the big enemy that Rawls wanted to knock on the head for very good reason was utilitarianism. But distributive justice, the duties of the successful towards the less successful, you need to distribute from the rich to the poor. That failed to answer the question, why should anybody do it? And so politically it failed. It just didn't find traction. Politicians couldn't sell it to voters. And so Rawls eventually decided he was a failure. And that left utilitarianism, which he very wisely thought was a heap of trash, as the default option. I think one way into the difference between Rawls and utilitarianism and Sandel is who has agency. And in Rawls, agency still lies with the rich. It's the duty of the rich to help the poorer people.
Distribute, yeah.
Yeah. And so the action, the agency, the power lies with the rich. They should use it better than they do. Here's what Rawls is saying. Be good. and the rich just say, why? And Michael Santel's contributive justice, the key concept is that everybody should have an obligation to contribute to common purposes, contribute to the whole, but there are some conditions that have to be filled before everybody has an obligation to contribute to the whole.
Right.
And the first obligation is equality of voice. So let's think of the obligations of the successful to the less successful. Have the less successful got roughly equality of voice in saying what these common purposes should be? And very clearly at the moment, in our own society, there's a massive discrepancy in voice. The least successful are basically people in the provinces. The further away from London, generally in England, the more disadvantaged you are. Same is true of Wales. So there's a regional disadvantage, the class disadvantage. The working class is disadvantaged relative to the middle class. So if we put those two together, the northern Midlands Welsh working class is disadvantaged relative to their opposites.
In London.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the London gilded
Yes.
cities of Oxford and Cambridge.
In terms of opportunities, for example, they'd be disadvantaged in terms of job opportunities, their options for career success and progression, if you want to live in London, work in London, etc. We actually spoke about this on the last episode with Sam Friedman, in terms of maybe the cultural capital they have as well and how that impacts their opportunities.
Absolutely. Who do you know who's got a decent job? You know, I mean,
In London.
Yeah. When I was a kid, you know, we were pretty poor, and there was one key decision I had to take about whether to go to Oxford, and if I wanted to go to Oxford, what to study. And the only middle class person I knew was my dentist. He just to have a lot of dental work, and so I asked my dentist, who was completely useless. But that's a practical example of a network effect, you know.
Yes.
Whereas now my kids are growing up in my household. If my teenagers want to learn about something complicated like nuclear power or AI, all they have to do is go next door.
Yeah.
So there's huge differences in network.
And I think that comes out, right? One of the things, I found really interesting when reading your book, I think that comes out when we talk about the UK Treasury. And I know you've mentioned that it's one of the least diverse and most exclusive departments out of all of them. And it tends to be made up predominantly by young, overconfident Oxbridge graduates who are given way more power to decide the...
My students, yeah, I know.
Yeah. You taught them, yeah.
For economics, to my shame.
Yeah.
Into the Treasury, they take their first job because of the Treasury recruits. It's like a monastery. Mm-hmm. Recruits people in their first job.
Yeah.
They've got a very good first degree from a very good university. Mm. And then they get a top master's degree from LSE or Oxford, and whoomph. Yeah. Then they go fast track. If they fancy travel, they choose the Foreign Office. And if they just fancy economics, using their economics, they go into the Treasury. So the Treasury is full of these very clever, very confident young kids who are then put in charge. And the Treasury philosophy is that they are a band, not only are they very socially exclusive, but a band of heroic warriors defending the taxpayer from wasteful spending. They've really got this Sigma utility.
Yeah. The unsung heroes of war, almost.
Yes, that's right. So they're heroic warriors defending the taxpayer against... Now, who are they mainly defending against? They're mainly defending against Whitehall. So they don't even look beyond Whitehall.
Yeah.
There are typically 30 cabinet ministers. 29 of them represent spending ministries, and so they're all advocating more spending.
Yeah.
And so the Treasury can't afford to devolve decision-taking to these spending ministries. So it has to take the decisions itself. Now, somewhere beyond the departments, my God, really beyond the departments, out there, north of the Ring Road, are the provinces and something called local government. Oh my God. Under no circumstances do we trust local government. It's even worse than the other ministries, right? It's mad spenders. All they want to do is spend. But worse than that, they don't even have any capacity. They don't know even how to spend it well. There's no capacity in local government. And so, unfortunately, we in the Treasury, who have the capacity, we have to take the decision. So if there's a need indeed to have a bus service in Manchester, we in the Treasury will plan the bus service for Manchester. We could have given it to the Ministry of Transport, but they spend it unwisely. We don't trust the ministry. Least of all do we trust the local government in Manchester, because they've no capacity, remember.
Even though they are the best placed to handle these issues, right? People who are on the ground, who are in these local communities. And I think you mentioned that the Department for Levelling Up, which was, designed to try and promote development in other parts of the UK and the North, etc., was actually given £0 as a budget. I was shocked when I read this in your book. They were given £0 as a budget. Effectively, this new department got loads of media attention, to try and appease the masses.
The flagship announced by Michael Gove, who was the department head, as a flagship. The government
flagship, yeah, and it received no money.
Yes, because the Treasury didn't believe in place-based approach for a start. And the last thing it wanted was to put money into local government.
Yeah.
So zero budget. Now, Michael Gove was an astute minister, and so he managed to negotiate a small budget by transferring money from elsewhere, because this was a department within the Home Office. And the Home Office had quite a big budget.
Yeah.
He persuaded the Home Secretary to move some of her budget into his budget. Once the Secretary found that out, they were furious, and so they removed Michael Gove's authority to spend the money, and so the department had to get approval for every single proposed expenditure. So it was systematic attempt to undermine. So there was a 4.3 billion budget over 4 years that the Home Office had transferred to Michael Gove. And of that 4.3 billion, which was not very much over 3 or 4 years, 10% got spent. It actually spent on levelling up, which is tiny. If you think
peanuts,
million between about 50 million people who live outside the London area, it's let's get our numbers. So it's, I think, something like £4 per head, £4 per head, and that's supposed to cure all the ills of having fallen behind. So it's just not serious sort of strategy.
And meanwhile, of course, the Elizabeth line is running millions over budget.
Its latest overrun in the budget is 5.5 billion.
5.5 billion.
We have it. So, of course, the Treasury very quietly slips that money to Transport for London to finance the Elizabeth line.
Yeah.
The purpose of the Elizabeth line is to complement the Jubilee line, both of which service Canary Wharf, which is where the financial sector is.
Yeah.
But if you go to Canary Wharf, unfortunately, it's now a disaster area, and there's a lot of empty offices. And I was there a couple of weeks ago because the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has just moved in. Why did they move there? Because rents are so cheap.
Oh, wow.
Why are the rents very cheap? Because none of the banks are there. They failed. The whole idea of creating a banking hub has failed. It was a huge speculation by the Treasury to build a financial centre in Canary Wharf. Massive amounts of money was invested, public money.
Yeah.
There was a sob story published in the Financial Times just a couple of weeks ago on Canary Wharf by a property developer who said it's really sad what's happened to Canary Wharf. It's failed, but we should spend more public money to make it work, because otherwise how could we justify having spent so much that we have already spent? The Treasury would look foolish unless it commits to spending more so that it really does make it work.
Some cost fallacy there, isn't it?
Yes, there's a certain fallacy there, but that's the spirit.
And while this is happening then, because up to now we've been talking about some of the reasons why we've seen spiraling down in certain regions of the country, and while this is happening, while we're seeing resources and energy being invested into London and, regions around it, what's happening in terms of the psychology? How are people feeling in these left behind regions? I mean, because surely that's part of the problem as well.
Absolutely. So the regions are spiraling down partly because investment flows out of them, contradicting Milton Friedman. But that's not very difficult to understand. I use in the book the idea of two dinghies hit by a gusty wind. One's hit by the gust and capsizes and the other sails on.
Yeah.
Your question then is, where do you put your money? Do you put it in the upright dinghy or the upside down one? Friedman seems to think you put it in the upside down dinghy, which is drifting with the current.
If it's floated too far, I guess you've got no choice.
The quote and the endorsement that I'm most proud of, apart from Michael Sandel, I suppose, is Raghu Rajan, who's the top professor at Chicago Business School, which is where old Friedman was. So
the neoliberal hub.
Yeah. So that's the simple economics of spiraling down. Investment flows out of these poor regions. But the more tragic thing is the social psychology, which is what you're referring to. And that is that our upside-down capsized dinghy looks and sees the upright dinghy, and the crew, shivering in the water, start to ask, why did we capsize and not the other dinghy? Well, we know the answer. It was hit by a stronger gust of wind. They don't. They just see the other dinghies merrily sailing away, waving at them. And so they start to ask themselves, why have we capsized? Mm-hmm. And the simple psychology of that takes us into blame. Who do we blame? Was it one of us? Was there some minority within our crew that we could blame? And so this is all too typical that the left-behind regions start to fall out amongst themselves and look for scapegoats. And business blames the local government blames business, workers blame employers blame workers. It's a circle of blame and recrimination. What that prevents is the community coming together to solve its problems. And so agency fragments. You need agency. The local level has contextual knowledge, which puts it in a position where it needs to think, what are the advantages of this community? What can we turn to success? But they don't do that. Instead, they just fall apart. And I see that again and again. It's really very sad, this fragmentation. And one step beyond that sort of self-blame is where people start to internalize the contempt that Hospital places have for them. The saddest thing in the whole book, I think, to me, was when I talked to school teachers in the north of England, and they said, well, a lot of the kids in our school say, well, the Southerners say we're thick, stupid. Okay, so we're thick. Well, there's not much point in trying then, is there? Because if we tried, we'd still get beaten. And
terrible.
So get this self-fulfilling sense of defeat and failure. And that is really, that is shameful. And so we go back to Michael Sandel and say, well, how did that come about? And Sandel, his whole concept of contributive justice, says, start doing things. One, do you have equality of voice and equality of respect? Those northern kids, very clearly, what they're indicating is a lack of equality of respect. They've picked up and even internalized the contempt of successful people in the South.
Well, it's terrible, especially given how young, in your book, you talk about how young some of these people are, to have that sense from that age. And I mean, to kind of move things on now, because we've talked quite a bit about the spiraling down, to move things in a more optimistic light about how we can begin to spiral up. And a more positive example that's often pointed to is Denmark and the Nordic states, which have been rather successful at promoting inclusive prosperity. And I was just, I'd love to hear a bit more about your opinions on why these countries have been able to be a kind of example for others, and what lessons perhaps we can learn from their successes.
Yeah, so Denmark now is hugely successful. It wasn't always. In the mid-19th century, Denmark was a brutal aristocracy, the worst in Europe. Peasants were being hung from the trees by an aggressive aristocracy, right, which was gradually overthrown by the leadership of the king, actually. The king decided to appeal to the people over the heads of the aristocracy, and that finally worked. So, of course, Danes have completely forgotten their own history. They think they've been modern Denmark forever, and they climbed their way out of it, bit by bit. But what is amazing about Denmark now is it is the closest approximation we could find anywhere to Michael Sandel's contributive justice,
right,
where everybody contributes to a common purpose. And the most revealing example of that is when COVID arrived. When COVID arrived, who was the leader in Denmark? It was a young woman called Mette Frederiksen who'd left school at 16 and was a mother, right? So was she super clever, super I know what's best? No, right? She was a very modest person.
Yeah, very humble.
Yeah. But she was able to say to other Danes, look, we don't know much about it. I, Mette Frederiksen, don't know anything about it. There's only one thing we know. This was in March 2020, just after COVID's arrived. Right? He said, no, you catch it from other people. And so here is my instruction to my fellow Danes, the new common purpose, right? Protect your neighbour from COVID. Don't inadvertently give your neighbour COVID. So if you're an old guy like Collier, you're the one in danger. So will you just stay out of the way of busy people like old Hamza here? He needs to get away. You stay out of the way, right? And, you know, Hamza, you got kids. If you got kids, don't let them go and kill Granny inadvertently, right? So protect your neighbour. That was the policy.
Communitarian, you know.
Communitarian, yeah.
Ethos, yeah.
Yeah. Everybody got to contribute to the whole. The whole, in this case, is the common purpose of minimizing the impact of COVID. And I was very struck by what happened across the pond in America. March 2020, there were queues outside gun shops. So it was less protect your neighbor than shoot your neighbor, which turned out not to be a great anti-COVID strategy. And we can also contrast with Germany, where the Chancellor of Germany at the time, Angela Merkel, had always avoided using any moral-type arguments. And he wanted to appeal to Germans on the basis of self-interest. And so she said, it's in your self-interest to get yourself vaccinated.
Pragmatism, would you call it? Is that what you?
Yes,
yeah,
certainly pragmatism.
Pragmatism,
but it's based on the assumption that people are economic man, basically.
Yeah,
your rational self-interest is to get yourself vaccinated.
Don't ask them to help their neighbor directly.
That's right.
Right? That's too much. It's too much for us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Remember, they're greedy, lazy, selfish. So,
yes, yeah.
But they're rational, and so just tell them your life will be safer if you get vaccinated. And by then, there were all these scares floating around everywhere about, the vaccines can cause you problems. And so many Germans decided, why take the risk of these vaccines? They may have side effects. I'm safest if I just don't get vaccinated, but stay out of the way. And of course, they then wildly overestimated their ability to stay out of the way. And so lots of Germans caught COVID because they got such a low vaccination rate. I asked the research department of the IMF to check two things. One is which country, bigger than a postage stamp, has the lowest economic mortality, excess mortality from COVID, and which country has the lowest economic hit from COVID. Right? So they did that for me just in time to get it into Left Behind. And the answer is the same country, in both cases. It's Denmark. Not only did they have the lowest excess mortality, they had the lowest economic hit.
Wow.
And so that communitarian purpose, coming together around a common purpose, is a very, very valuable thing to have built. And Denmark, modern Denmark, has built that. And I think once you've got that for a purpose like avoiding COVID, you can use it for many other purposes. But it does depend on one aspect, which is why Denmark is often criticized. It depends upon reciprocity. Everybody knowing that everybody else is going to do the same thing. That not will I be protecting them, but they'll be protecting me.
Yeah.
And that depends upon not having too many people come in who don't understand the society, right? And so Denmark's been very slow in accepting immigration.
Interesting.
And this because they're wary of preserving. They want to bring, they do accept immigrants, but the pace at which they absorb them has to be slow enough that the immigrants integrate. If you or I went to Denmark, we'd be expected to learn Danish, which, believe me, is harder than you might think.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and so you'd have to learn Danish, and you'd have to integrate into the culture. They're not interested in building a multicultural society.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, so
very interesting.
Societies have many advantageous features, but what they don't have is this feature of ready building of common purpose.
Solidarity, a really strong sense of solidarity. Yeah. And I'm thinking in the UK, even while Denmark was doing that, we were fighting for toilet roll. So
yeah, exactly. Yes, yeah. yes. So that's the downside of the communitarian approach, is that reciprocity depends upon this sort of preservation of a common, if you like, a sort of common culture.
Yeah.
And that's very limiting. You know, Europe as a whole is clearly not a common culture. And European community is an interesting attempt to get as far as you can with a multicultural community. You know?
But
Germans don't trust Italians.
Yeah. And, pardon my French, pardon my German, they're all,
yeah, exactly.
It slurs. And I mean, sorry, just to cut in here, but I suppose one of the things that we see on the global stage, and I think in countries as well, is this attempt by the affluent, powerful, influential, whatever you would like to call them, to try and impose their values and their beliefs and approaches on others. We've seen this, as you say, with the democracy example. We also see this on a global stage with the IMF, where there's certain expectations in terms of the values that countries have to adopt in order to acquire the aid that they would like. And this is a real danger. I think it's something that you've talked about and talk about the need to be on guard against. So I was just wondering if you could say a bit about how we can prevent this type of moral imperialism moving forward, and how it might be damaging to countries and counterproductive in many ways.
Yes. So I'll give you the example of climate change and the problem of carbon-based energy. And very clearly, the world has got to gradually wean itself off carbon-based energy. Now, the question is, whose carbon-based energy should be left in the ground? They're called stranded assets. Let's take oil. Right? Whose oil should be left in the ground? We've already discovered enough oil that if we burnt it all, we'd all fry, right? But some oil's got to stay in the ground. And then the question is, whose oil should stay in the ground? Let's say just off the coast of West Africa, a poor country discovers an oil field. Should the IMF and the World Bank say, you've got to leave that in the ground? To my mind, the question is, should it be the oil of the richest countries in the world that stays in the ground, or should it be the oil of the poorest? And once you pose that question, it's pretty obvious that it should be the oil of the richest that stays in the, not the oil of the poorest.
Of course.
The moment public policy, international public policy such as it is very geared to who discovered their stuff first. So that America's discovered its oil long ago. It's just discovered a lot more recently with shale. And so America's merrily taking its oil out of the ground, but it's using its vote on the IMF and the World Bank to say, make sure that newly discovered oil in Africa stays in the ground. Now, that seems to me morally shameful.
Yeah.
I was just online to Australia, right? Australia is at the moment digging up huge quantities of coal, as is Germany. Only recently opened new coal fields. Should they be telling African countries to keep their coal and oil in the ground? I don't think so, really. So I think the current argument by the International Energy Agency is about efficiency. It's saying it's more efficient to use the oil we've already discovered and is being extracted than to spend resources opening up new fields. But efficiency is not the only criterion here. If efficiency ends up implying something that is grossly unequal, which it does, then it's morally wrong. And so it's my core example of moral imperialism. And it's really, it goes back to the question, who is doing what to whom? Here, Americans and Germans and Australians are using their votes in the big international institutions to do things that will end up meaning that there are some very poor people stay poor, and that moral implication of what they're doing hasn't been surfaced. And so it's the business of Left Behind and other books on this subject to try and highlight that. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm very pleased that it's just coming out in German. There's an American edition.
Yes.
It will be broadcast in Australia,
Exciting stuff.
These people have to face the true moral implications of their actions, and they can't hide behind arguments of efficiency when really what's lurking behind efficiency arguments is self-interest.
Yeah. What's good for them isn't necessarily what's good for everyone else, I suppose.
That's right.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've really enjoyed chatting.
Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it too.
If you're interested in the deeper philosophical questions around economic development, subscribe to our newsletter for an extended interview, where Paul and I discuss urbanization and the ways that microfinance can be used to help develop poor countries.